The night before Halloween of 2006, I was walking down the sidewalk to my friend's house. As I was making my way down the sidewalk, I saw something moving across the street, a little ways in front of me. I wasn't too familiar with the Halloween movies at the time, but I did recognize a Michael Myers mask as I watched the figure walk into the front yard of a house that was just on the other side of the street. It then stopped, looked in my direction, and then turned and kept walking across the front yard. I was more weirded out than afraid. I figured this guy must have been someone who lived there and was playing a practical joke on someone. I continued to my friend's house and eventually forgot all about it. The next morning I was waiting for the school bus to come pick up me and my sister. It was still pretty early in the morning. Fog was rising up from the grass and the frost was slowly melting off the windshields of some of the nearby parked cars. I was just wandering up and down the sidewalk when I saw the Michael Myers guy again. This time, he was directly across the road, standing between two garages and looking my way. I pointed him out to my sister, but he was standing so still that we assumed that he was some kind of Halloween decoration. I was tempted to call out to him, but I decided against it. And even in my 12-year-old mind, I felt genuine alarm that an adult could walk around with a mask on this early and stare at someone else's children. It wasn't until I was on the bus that the figure finally moved. I tried to point him out to my sister, but the bus was already moving and he was out of sight. That night was Halloween, and my sister and I went out dressed as Ash and Misty, and my father accompanied us, occasionally saying, "He got you," in a really loud and squeaky voice when other people were close by to embarrass us. It wasn't until we were on our way home that I saw Michael Myers again. He was walking down the side of the road behind us. Other people were walking by him without even reacting. I tried to point him out to my father, but he barely looked twice at the figure. When we got home, I watched from my bedroom as the figure stood outside our front lawn. He waited there for a few minutes before disappearing around the side of our house. Now I was starting to get nervous. I asked my dad if one of his friends was messing with us, and I begged him to take a look outside. But he came back a minute later with a completely carefree attitude, saying there was no one there. Later that night, my sister crept into my room and whispered that there was someone outside of her bedroom window. Instead of calling out to my parents, who were both asleep, I grabbed my flashlight and I followed her back to her room. I told her not to turn on any lights, and when we got to the window, I turned on the flashlight and shone the beam directly into the face of Michael Myers. He was standing directly outside, peering through the window. His hands were cupped against his eyes to help him see inside. When the light hit him, you would think he would have bolted, but instead he remained motionless. He opened his hands and slapped the window hard enough to knock a framed picture off the wall. I screamed like I was being eaten by a shark. The figure then put his right index finger up to the lips of his mask, as if telling me to shush. He then vanished into the darkness. My father then burst into the room and we both started crying as we told him what we saw. The cops were called, but they took their time getting there, obviously not very concerned that it was another Halloween prank. And had we not seen the stranger before that night, I may have believed that too. The neighborhood was searched, but no one wearing a Michael Myers mask was found. This upcoming Halloween will be my 40th birthday, and even after nearly 25 years, the terrifying memory of that night has never faded. You see, I lost my virginity in a pumpkin patch on Halloween. I know, cliché. Specifically, I lost it in the bed of a pickup truck while it was parked in the pumpkin patch. To give you an idea of the patch, it was maybe 80 by 100 feet and fenced off by a wire mesh to prevent cows from getting in. The truck was parked just inside the only gate. Myself and my date had settled there right before the sun went down. My house was just across the street from the pumpkin patch. We shared a bottle of wine, awkwardly talked for a while, and then got to business. My family and I had 2 border collies, and as we were changing positions, the dogs have wandered in and started barking at us. My date and I paused and drunkenly, playfully began throwing scraps of food out into the pumpkins for them to chase. After a couple minutes of that, we continued right where we left off. After we were done, we sat there in the truck and looked up at the stars while the dogs wandered off around sniffing random things. After a short while, I saw my father return home, pulling into the driveway across the street. The dogs bounded out of the patch towards him, and me and my date quickly began to dress ourselves. Once we were fully clothed, we just sat on the tailgate and kept talking as we watched my dad pet the dogs and then go into the house. It was about then when we heard it, a rustling sound coming from the patch somewhere behind us. We both paused and turned. At this point, there was only moonlight to illuminate our surroundings, but it was enough. And this is exactly what we saw. A single pumpkin began to rise up out of the patch, but not like someone was lifting it. It was kind of sideways, like it had been resting on its side and now it was sitting up. For a split second, I thought that someone was raising this pumpkin out of the patch on a stick or a metal bar. But then the stick changed position. It coiled like a snake and then shot straight up like a man would if he went from a squatting position to a standing position. I then saw 2 spindly legs with knee joints protruding from the thing, but no arms. There was a buzzing in my ear, and all of a sudden my date screamed. We both jumped off the truck and booked it out of the patch and sprinted towards my house. I glanced back once, and I'll swear on whatever you want me to swear on. A tall, skeletal figure was leaning over the truck, where we had just both been sitting, and I caught a glimpse of 2 beady red eyes staring back at me. We made it to my garage and forced our way in through the kitchen door. I began screaming at my dad to get his gun. It wasn't until I saw the blood on the kitchen floor that I realized that my nose had been bleeding. Even more alarming, my date's nose was gushing blood as well. I told my dad that there was something in the pumpkin patch. He grabbed his gun and power walked out of the house, the dogs following closely behind him. But they stopped when halfway there, refusing to come any closer to the pumpkin patch. When my dad returned, he was livid. He wanted to know what had damaged the fence and broke the tailgate off of my truck, which technically was his truck. I could only shiver in confusion and abject terror. He reported that something had ripped the tailgate right off my truck and then tore out of the patch from inside and destroyed a huge section of fence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I cowered in terror in the living room with all the lights on. The next day, the police came to examine the scene. The wire fence had been torn out of the ground and dragged a short distance away, and there was no clear indication of what specifically had done it. My father and the police were convinced that it was a trespasser pulling a Halloween prank, but I never believed that for a moment. I tried to explain that the dogs had been pounding through the patch just 2 minutes before the thing had appeared, and neither of them had made a sound to alert us that there was a trespasser nearby. Furthermore, the entry gate to the patch made plenty of noise whenever the wind rattled it. So if someone climbed over it, it would make even more noise, and we had been sitting right by the gate. Another thing that terrified me was the shape of the thing as it stood. Even if it was a trespasser with an elaborate costume, none of that would even begin to explain the tailgate, the destroyed fence, the nosebleeds, and our dogs being too nervous to approach the patch, or the eyes that I had caught a glimpse of. And my father went to his grave believing that he had been vandalized by trespassers. My date and I concluded later that whatever it was, it hadn't been human or an animal. I don't tell the story often because I mostly get the same Charlie Brown joke. It was the Great Pumpkin, so no one really takes me seriously. But I've heard that skinwalkers can take the form of anything that best suits their surroundings. Our property wasn't anywhere near a Native American reservation, but I can't think of anything else that it could have been. So what do you think it was? It's been 10 years since I've spoken about this incident. On Halloween of 2009, me and my younger sister, along with a couple of our friends, went out trick-or-treating. I was only 8 years old at the time. My younger sister was 5. My best friend's older brother was 17, and it was his responsibility to look after us that night. This took place in London, and at the time we hardly had any crimes in our area. The night went off without a hitch, and we were all planning on calling it an evening. Since we had collected enough candy, my best friend's older brother was just about to call my dad. But before he could dial the number, he received a call from my dad. He let him know where to come and pick us up, and after a few minutes, my dad came and collected me and my sister. We said goodbye to our friends and thanked them for a fun evening. As my dad was driving my sister and I back home, he seemed on edge. Now, since I was only 8, I kept babbling on about how much candy we had collected and how we couldn't wait to get home to eat them. My dad wasn't listening. He just looked really anxious about something. As soon as we got back home, I entered my house to find my mother, my aunt, and my cousin sitting around the living room. I greeted them, and my mother hugged both me and my sister. My dad set us down and told us that we could never go out trick-or-treating ever again. Now, because I was 8, I began throwing a tantrum, complaining how I loved Halloween and that my parents were being unfair. My little sister was too young to even care. She was too busy going through the candy that we had just collected. So after 2009, me and my sister never went out for Halloween. We didn't bother throwing a tantrum since we knew it would be pointless. However, in 2012, my brother was born, and last year in 2018, he turned 6. My father finally relented and agreed to take my little brother and sister out trick-or-treating. By this time, Halloween had lost its appeal for me, and I didn't want to go out anyway. My little brother gets his way since he's the youngest, and he loves Halloween. I decided to ask my mom why she didn't allow me and my sister to go out on Halloween after 2009. She sighed and explained to me that a boy from our area had gone out trick-or-treating in the same area. He was with his friends, but had somehow separated from the group. He ended up knocking on the door of an old house that was located at the end of a quiet street. I'll spare you the gory details, but the boy's body was found in the house after several people heard screaming and called the police. The boy's arm had been removed from his body, and he died from blood loss. The police had been going door to door and warning parents about what happened, and that's when my dad came and collected us. My mother told me that they arrested an old mentally deranged man in connection with a crime, but Halloween would never be the same again for my neighborhood. I had heard rumors about a boy who was killed on Halloween at my school, but I never took it seriously. I thought it was just a local urban legend, but now I understood why my dad looked so worried that night. The house where the boy was found, which is only a few blocks away from mine, now sits abandoned with its windows boarded up. People around here jokingly refer to it as the Myers house. Halloween is pretty much ruined for me. I'll be staying home again this year. However, my brother, who's now 7, can't wait for Halloween. I just hope my dad keeps a close eye on him. Halloween used to be one of my favorite holidays. Now I kind of just enjoy it when I have a decent party to go to. In 2018, when I was a senior in college, my friend Tracy's sorority was going to be throwing a big Halloween party at the sorority house. She said I could bring one friend since they didn't want too many outsiders at the party. So I invited my best friend, Cody. We are very last-minute people when it comes to Halloween costumes. The party was that night and we didn't have anything. Cody was working late, so he'd have to meet me right before the party. So he asked me to go get a costume for him, and he'd just Venmo me the money. I ran to the nearby Spirit Halloween store that opened up like 5 minutes from my house. I was just shotgunning it. I picked up Where's Waldo costume for myself and a Superman costume for Cody. Both 2 of the cheaper costumes they had. Everything was normal until I got to the cashier. I was on the phone with Cody telling him about the costume I had got him and giving him the details about the party. I told him which sorority it was that Tracy got us the invite, gave him the address, and then he convinced me to pick him up instead of just meeting. Stuff like that. All this was said as the cashier was watching me. He was some guy who was decently older than me, but because of his receding hairline, I couldn't quite gauge as to whether he was in his late 30s or low 40s. He wore glasses though, and had a skinny-ish build and an awkward presence. As he rang up the 2 costumes, he had a comment, something along the lines of, "Sounds like a fun party tonight, huh?" I chuckled and said, "Yeah." Then he started asking more details, like if it's an open invite. I said, "It's closed invite and that I barely got an invite." He said, "It's all good." Then he shook my hand and introduced himself as Mike, so I did the same, and I told him my name was Sean, and I left. It was weird. Fast forward to later that night, I picked up Cody and we arrived at the party around 10 p.m. It sounded loud inside, and there were multiple groups of people entering the house before we were at the door. A girl asked us who we knew there, and I told her Tracy, and she let us in, and we were in this huge living room area. Music blasting, all the lights dimmed low, Halloween decorations everywhere, and to top it off, people with red cups full of booze crowding the place. We saw Tracy and hung around her for a while. We played beer pong and other drinking games. It was a very legit party. But then at some point, there was a commotion at the front door area. Cody, Tracy, and I and a few others walked over, and the girl at the door started yelling out, "Where's Tracy?" She came forward, and the girl asked, "Who is Sean?" I said, "I am." Then she asked me who that creepy guy we invited was. I was confused and I said, "Who?" She described some older-looking man in a cowboy costume with a fake mustache. He apparently inappropriately touched one of the girls, trying to get her into a separate room, and she screamed for help. Then he took off with something in his pocket. None of the guys chased after him or anything. Immediately, I thought of the cashier from Spirit Halloween. I told them about it, and everyone got even more creeped out. The party went on, but they were a lot more cautious about who they were letting in. They even considered calling the cops for a second. That whole thing really killed my vibe, and we didn't stay much longer after that. In total, we were probably at the party for a couple of hours at most, and we left a little past midnight. I think I didn't drink much. As I started my car, the car parked like 2 cars behind us also turned on theirs. And as I drove in the direction of Cody's house, the car started to follow. Cody and I were sure it had to be him after it made 4 of the same turns, so I pulled to the side of the road, egging him to pull over. But the car just stopped for a few seconds, then basically floored it past us. We didn't get a good look at who was inside, but I'm still positive it was him. After dropping off Cody down the block from his house, just being cautious, I was staying very aware of my surroundings. I was staying very aware of my surroundings, and because of that, I noticed a car in the near distance with its lights off, telling me it looked like the same car. I got to a main road once again, pulled over and waited. And the car, once again, waited. Then a few seconds later, turned on its lights and floored it in the far left lane, passing me. I was obviously shook and drove home as fast as I could while I was sure I wasn't being followed. I called that Spirit Halloween location the next day and reported the cashier. They thanked me for the information, but I never went back there, so I wouldn't know if he was fired or anything. Looking back, I wonder if I could have and should have pressed charges. Regardless, I have no idea what he could have possibly wanted from me, but either way, I'm happy he didn't find out where I live. Halloween of 2019 was the most terrifying night of my life. I live in Australia, and because we don't celebrate Halloween as enthusiastically, we don't get as many trick-or-treaters around. Around 5 or 6 people at the most. I am personally a huge fan of Halloween, though to the dismay of my parents who would prefer not to acknowledge it. Obviously, that leaves me in charge of putting up decorations and handing out candy. This particular year, Halloween fell on a school night, and a storm began just after 6 o'clock, which unfortunately meant my efforts preparing the decorations had pretty much gone to waste. So, ignoring my better judgment, I still waited for trick-or-treaters in the living room and watched The Conjuring to pass time. Around an hour and a half later, I got a message from my friend M on our group chat, asking if anyone would like to mess around and go trick-or-treating. At first, I was confused. We hadn't gone trick-or-treating in over 5 years, but I decided it would make the night more enjoyable, as nobody was knocking on the door anyway. My other friends, who I'll call S, C, and H, all agreed, and asked them where we should meet up. M quickly replied he couldn't make it, which is strange because he was the one who offered to go trick-or-treating. But he suggested a house with lots of candy. Me, S, C, and H all arrived at the house within a half an hour. A large table with a pumpkin bowl filled with lollipops stood on the front porch. And after checking the windows to make sure we weren't being watched, we emptied the ball between us, leaving only a few to avoid suspicion. As we turned around to leave, we were greeted by 2 men dressed as clowns approaching us in the driveway. They had huge painted smiles and tilted heads, and I could tell we were all creeped out. One of my friends screamed as they started bolting towards us, one squeaking a rubber nose as they chased us. After running for what felt like an eternity, we finally lost them. We decided to go to M's house so we could discuss what had just happened in a safe area. However, when M answered the door, he burst into laughter. "What the hell are you guys doing?" he said, confused. "You told us to go out trick-or-treating. Can you just let us inside?" S replied. After sitting down on M's couch, we all soon realized M had lost his phone earlier that day, and a stranger had suggested the idea of going to that house, presumably some sort of trap from the clowns. After another half hour, I cautiously made my way home by 9:30, finished my movie, and went outside to collect the candy bowl I set up. I was shocked to see the bowl was completely empty. However, my stomach turned when I saw a clown nose that was now laying inside of it. I told my parents everything that happened and showed them the clown nose that had been left at our house. They assured me that it was just some Halloween prank. I woke up around 1 a.m. to noises coming from my bedroom window like rocks hitting the glass. Although I was scared half to death, my curiosity got the better of me. I eventually opened the blinds. My Halloween decorations were destroyed and littered the ground below. I stared motionless, in complete shock, until a lollipop was thrown at the window, breaking my trance. I looked up and I saw them. The 2 clowns perched upon my neighbor's roof looking down at me. I screamed and ran away towards my parents' room. I'll skip the details that followed, but the police were called and the clowns were not found. The officers informed us that they would check the house my friends and I had trick-or-treated at, and they left in about a half an hour. The following morning, we were told the house was abandoned, and M's phone was discovered inside. That day at school, I had learned M, S, C, and H all had creepy experiences during the night as well. I'm not sure if the clowns followed us home or they somehow tracked us through M's phone. All I know is that Halloween is only a few weeks away, and I'm completely terrified they'll return. Hello everyone. For the month of October in 2016, I worked at Party City as a seasonal job. It was pretty hectic for the Halloween season, obviously. I got stuck on the night shift on weekends since I didn't have early classes. The location I worked at changed its closing hours on weeknights to 11 p.m. during the Halloween season. My shift would start usually at 5, and I'd work till close, and the rush would die off after 9. After 10, there would be hardly anyone left in the store, especially on weekdays. On my shift in the day in question, I started work at what was referred to as a costume grabber. I would be told on walkie-talkie what costume and what size to grab so that I could hand it to the customer and they could try it on. After it quieted down and later on in my shift, I was told to start cleaning up the aisles and restocking and bringing stuff from either up from or down to the basement. That got tiring quickly because it was a lot of walking up and down stairs. Past 10, there were only about 4 of us still working. A girl named Maria working the cash register, Kyle cleaning up the aisles and stocking, Ashley, the supervisor for the night shift, and then me, the back and forth basement work. The basement was at least connected straight to the upstairs costume storage room, so it wasn't a super long walk from the basement. I took a 10-minute breather and then went to continue lugging boxes from the basement up to the costume storage room. The lights of the basement had been recently turned off by someone. I figured Ashley, so I flipped the light switch back on, and down into the basement I went. As I was lifting a box of girls' costumes, I heard something fall on the other side of the basement. Not to make you think this basement was really big, it was just one big circle full of boxes, with a big shelf in the middle. I put down the box I was holding and slowly peered my head around the shelf. There was someone in a white hooded robe costume and a scary monster mask. Of course, I jumped back at first. Then I laughed, saying, "You got me." Whichever of my coworkers was in the costume didn't speak though. They just tilted their head to the side a bit, as if they were still messing with me. I had a feeling it was Ashley at first, even though she would supervise. Some nights, she was a clown. But then I realized this person was way too tall to be Ashley, so it had to be Kyle. I tried approaching him to remove the mask, and he just backed away from me though. Then I looked down at the boots on his feet. They were dirty, heavy work boots that I knew for a fact Kyle wasn't wearing. I started getting shivers and I went back upstairs without running to avoid suspicion. I shut the basement door and went straight to Ashley, who was talking to Maria by the register. I asked, "Where's Kyle?" And he literally called, "What's up?" from a nearby aisle. That's when panic set in. I asked if there was anyone working that night, and she said everyone went home. So I told her someone was in the basement in a costume who didn't belong there. Kyle and Ashley came with me to the basement so I could prove it to them. But like any cliche horror scenario, whoever was down there was gone. There was a back exit in the upstairs costume room for unloading truck shipments. It was possible that the intruder exited through there. Ashley sped through the security footage of the past hour and didn't see anyone enter the costume room, except for me. But there wasn't a camera in the basement, or the actual costume room itself. Part of me felt like it was a prank, and that if I went back down there I'd find the person in the costume again. But my job was my job, and I had to get back down there to continue stocking the costume room. When I got back down there, I once again picked up a box of girl costumes I originally was trying to bring up, got it upstairs and stopped, because I thought I may have heard the noise of a small plastic bag being slightly crumpled. Of course, I didn't want to stay down there to find out alone. I wasn't getting paid enough. My shift was almost over, so I lugged the heavy box upstairs, dropped it in the costume room, and went back to the basement door to shut the light off. Before I did, I looked down the staircase, and at the bottom is that person in the white robe costume again, only this time with no mask. I saw his smiling face looking up at me. I slammed the door shut and ran out to Ashley and the rest, screaming for help. They came as fast as they could to the costume room, but the back door inside the costume room was as wide open as the basement door. This time, for real, he was gone. The one camera on the outside delivery area didn't even catch him. I don't really know if that intruder managed to steal anything other than the costume he was wearing. For all I know, it could have been just one big Halloween prank, or he might have been there looking to actually hurt someone. For all I knew, it was an armed robber though, and I treated the situation as though my life were in danger. Did you like this story? Check out our channel for more.